When the user or task processor opens a task to process it, remember there will be a first approver and a second approver. The user interface page for the second approver is only needed if the first approver pre-approves the claim. The second approver page is not needed when the first approver denies the claim. We'll need two different pick list artifacts for each level of approver's options. Because these are manual tasks, we'll need a first approval activity page tied to the first approval manual activity in the business process. Likewise, we need another activity page for the second approval manual activity in the business process. As developers who use xCP Designer, we create these manual tasks using the Process UI node in the User Interface tab. By default, these task pages have a lot of action buttons and other widgets that we don't always need. It's a good idea that xCP Designer adds them for us. It's easier to remove something that's been configured for us than it is to remember how to create it in the first place. In our case, we should remove all the widgets that aren't needed for our application, so we'll be doing that in this exercise. The claim page fragment will come in handy so that the user configuration for the claim-related widgets is the same between all the pages. Finally, there's a large collection of interactions that come with these Process UI or task pages. For some of them, we need to configure the inputs as process variables. These pick lists and activity pages that we'll configure will allow users to interact with the claim processing process and update the status of the claim automatically. So let's get started by defining a pick list that will serve as a response drop-down list when first approving or denying a claim. It'll be used on an activity page created later. Models tab. Expand the Pick Lists tab, then right-click Pick Lists and select New Pick List. For label, enter First Review Response, then click Finish. From the Basics tab, for data type, select Integer. Now select the Entries tab. Click the green Add Entry button to start adding label value pair entries. To speed up data entry, we can press the Tab key to automatically add a new row. So add Pre-Approve with a value of 1, then Deny with a value of 3. Don't forget that these values need to match the corresponding claim status pick list values. Close and save the First Review Response tab. Now let's add another pick list for the second reviewer's manual activity page actions. Right-click the Pick Lists node and select New Pick List. For label, enter Second Review Response, and then click Finish. In the Basics tab, for data type, select Integer, then select the Entries tab. Click the green Add Entry button to start adding label value pair entries. Add Approve with a value of 2, then Deny with a value of 3. And remember, these values need to match the corresponding claim status pick list values. So we can close and save the Second Review Response tab now. Now we need to create a page for the first approval manual activity. Each manual or user activity in the process requires a user interface page so that the user can see and acquire the task. Let's start by creating the page for the first approval activity. In the xCP Navigator, select the User Interface tab. Expand the Process UI node. Remember, this is the node that we use to create UI pages for manual business process tasks. Right-click the Claim Processing process and select New Page. For Specific Object Model, ensure that it shows Claim Processing. For Activity, select the First Approval Manual Process activity. For Label, ensure that it's set to Claim Processing First Approval, and then click Finish. There are very many widgets and interactions that are automatically added to the page based on the configuration of the process and the activity. There are also widgets that aren't visible. The first is the Instructions widget at the middle center under the Assign button. The second is the Task Subject widget next to the task icon. The default xCP Designer generated layout has selector widgets for each package defined in the process. The purpose of these selectors is to allow the user to be able to locate an instance of the correct type in the repository. If you look at the Problems pane, you'll see that for us, it'll be easier to remove the widgets instead of completing the configuration for these packages. So double-click the Claim Processing First Approval tab to expand the Layout tab. Now that we've had a chance to look at the default layout for a manual activity, let's restore the layout and continue configuring our task page. Close the Claim Processing Model tab. Now select the Task Subject widget. In the Properties pane, slide the pane over to expose the Value section at the right. Notice that the value that will be displayed is configured in this expression. This can display the name of the task subject of the current task of the activity's execution data. Now select the Instructions widget just below the Assign button. In the Properties pane, for ID, enter Instructions. Then, for the value to display, the instructions of the current task of the process's execution data of the first approval activity. It's important to point out the default layout in the Task Details tab. It has a selector object placed on the page for each package defined in the business process associated with this page. The purpose of these selectors is to allow the user to locate and choose an instance of the corresponding type in the document and repository. In many cases, the package would already be set up when the process is initiated, so these selectors will not be required. So, in this step, we'll delete all of them. Okay, at this point, let's remove all the widgets and interactions that are not needed on the Layout tab of this page editor. Let's take a look at the Problems tab. Selecting the Problems tab reveals that for each of these selectors, further configuration is needed to make them functional. We'd first have to create a selector action flow and assign it, and choose which attribute to use as the display value of the selector. Select the Task Details tab. Now select the Attachments tab. This business process doesn't use the process attachments, so the entire Attachments tab can be removed. Right-click and select Delete. This will delete the Attachments tab and all the widgets it contains. Since we deleted the Attachments tab, we don't need the interaction that was added as a data source for the attachments. So let's expand the Interactions pane and right-click on the Data Source for Attachments interaction and select Delete. We can collapse the Interactions tab now. In the Task Details tab, it shows the packages for the process, but they were added when the process was initiated. Therefore, we can delete these package selector widgets. Select the entire Packages column box. Right-click and select Delete. In the Task Details tab, below the Packages column box, notice that there was a default widget added for the vResponse process variable. It needs to be replaced with a drop-down list, so we can delete this one too. Select the entire Variables column box, right-click, and select Delete. To get a better bird's-eye view of the entire layout, let's temporarily move the Widgets pane out of the way. A large number of action button widgets were automatically added to the page related to the work queue, because the task can be assigned, reassigned, moved from one queue to another, and so on. Let's move the queue-related action buttons, Assign, Unassign, Reassign, and Change Work Queue, top of the layout to the bottom below the Tab Group widget box. If we double-click the Claim Processing First Approval tab, we can almost see the entire simplified layout. Okay, let's restore the layout. The next step is to add widgets that are required for viewing all the necessary details of the claim, policy, and vehicle objects in order to make it easier to make a quick decision. So let's select the Task Details tab. Now drag a column box widget into the Task Details tab. In the Properties pane, for ID, enter Details. For Title, clear the title value. The label of the tab will serve as the label that we need. Right-click the first column of the column box and select Insert Column on Right. So now we have three columns. The first column will contain the claim details, the second column will contain the policy details, and the third column will contain the vehicle details. In the first column, add 4 value display widgets and configure them to display the 4 main attributes of a claim, namely incident date, incident location, amount, and vehicle in motion. Don't forget to configure the data type and value expressions for each. Now let's use a page fragment to display the policy information in the second column. To do that, scroll the layout pane to expose the second column. Then drag a page fragment widget into the second column. In the Properties pane, for ID, enter Policy. For label, enter Policy. For the page fragment, select Page Fragment ID and click the Selector button. Select View Policy Details, then click Finish. Setting the page fragment ID value simply informs the page which widgets to display in the fragment area. To configure where the data for the page fragment comes from at runtime, we configure the page fragment input mapping value section in the Properties pane. To force xCP Designer to refresh the page fragment input mapping, Click on the first column of the column box widget and then click back on the page fragment widget. The table now shows ID and model as two possible input name rows. In the Selector dialog, in the top pane, navigate to and select First Approval, Packages, and then PKG_policy. In the bottom pane, select Object ID, and then click OK. Take note of the value expression for the ID input as claim processing first approval process packages package policy.id. Now we're ready to configure the third column for the vehicle attributes. Now drag another 4 value display widgets into the third column of the column box and configure them to represent the values of the 4 main vehicle attributes, namely make, model, year, and VIN number. Don't forget to select vehicle make as the data type for make and integer for the data type for year. Although the make attribute of the vehicle model is a string, it's a string pick list. If we incorrectly set the data type to string, then we'll see the value such as Toyo instead of seeing the display label such as Toyota at runtime. Let's remember to set the data type for the year attribute as an integer. Now select the History tab. In this History tab, we'll list the documents that will get submitted to the claim. However, there won't be any documents yet because that comes in the next section. Let's right-click the History tab and select Insert Tab Before. In the Properties pane for Label, enter Claim Documents. Into the Claim Documents tab. In the Properties pane, under the Root Folder section at the right, select Folder ID. Now click the Expression Wizard button. In the top pane, navigate to and select First Approval, Packages. In the bottom pane, select Object ID. Then click OK. next step is to re-add the ability for a user to select the response when reviewing the claim. Select the column in the column box below the Acquire Buttons column box. As we mentioned before, there's a display widget that will show the task instructions. In the Properties pane, for orientation, select Vertical. Now drag a drop-down list widget into the column below the Value Display widget. In the Properties pane, for ID, enter Response. And for label, enter Response. Under the Value section at the right, set the data type to Integer. And choose the Pick List radio button and select First Review Response as a source of the values for the pick list. Select the Behavior tab. Then click the Expression Wizard button for Disabled When. In the top pane, navigate to and select First Approval, Execution Data, Current Task. In the bottom pane, select Task State. Then click OK. Complete the expression by adding to the end of the expression space 0. This expression ensures that the drop-down list widget is not enabled until the task is acquired by a user. Now go back to the General tab. Alright, we've seen that with other pages and context menus that we need to configure what happens after an action is completed. For this page, the user will click the Complete button when they have completed an action. Therefore, let's select the Complete button, and in the Properties pane, under the Action section at the right, for When Done Go To, select Specific Page, and for Page, select the Tasks page. Expand the Interactions tab and select the Complete Task First Approval Claim Processing-1 Interaction instance. Select the Inputs tab, expand the Variables node, and double-click the v_response process variable. In the top pane, navigate to and select Widgets Response. In the bottom pane, select Value. Then click OK. Now in the Inputs tab, navigate to and double-click Packages, Package Claim, Claim Status. In the top pane, navigate to and select Widgets Response. In the bottom pane, select Value, and then click OK. Now double-click Package Claim, Object ID. In the top pane, select First Approval, Packages, Package Claim, and in the bottom pane, select Object ID. Now click OK. Finally, double-click Package Vehicle, Object ID. In the top pane, navigate to and select First Approval, Packages, and Package Vehicle. In the bottom pane, select Object ID, and then click OK. Now we're done with the interactions, so let's collapse the Interactions pane. Save the Claim Processing First Approval artifact, check the Problems tab for errors, and close the Claim Processing First Approval tab. Now we're ready to create the Process UI page for the second approval manual activity. Rather than repeating all the steps that we just took to create the first approval activity page, let's use the duplicate feature and just modify the expressions and interactions that need to be changed. Start by right-clicking on the Claim Processing First Approval page and select Duplicate. For label, enter Claim Processing Second Approval. For activity, select Second Approval, and then click Finish. On the Basics tab, for page title, change it to Claim Processing Second Approval. Now select the Layout tab. In the second column of the Task Details tab, select the Policy Page Fragment widget. In the Properties pane, under the Page Fragment Input Mapping section at the right, change the expression to reflect that this is the second activity. Now select the Response drop-down list widget. In the Properties pane, under the Value section at the right, change the pick list value to Second Review Response so that it shows the options available to the second reviewer and not the first. So that was much quicker than redoing all the steps for the first approval task page, wasn't it? Alright, we can now save, check the Problems tab for errors, and then close the Editor tab. We're now almost ready to test the task pages, but first we're going to need to trigger the start of the claim processing process using a business event when a new claim is created.